and we'll get that connected. Confirm it there. All right. We are going live. I'm going to go ahead and kick off as we normally do, and then we'll dive into 3.10. Get to the actual page. What a long few days. 240, excellent. All right. So, as always, thank all of you for joining us today at this wonderful, wonderful time we're having on the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Today we're moving into section 3.10, that of capitalist representation. The movement of writing, the movement of meaning, the movement of representation in general, how we've gone from pictographs to that of the written word under the despot to something more, something a bit more insidious, to say the least. Excitedly, I'm jazzed to be jumping into this, but we will go ahead and do what we can. Before we get going, does anyone have any thoughts, notes, anything that we have to chat about before we dive in, or should I just go ahead and start right into our reading?
Just wanted to say it's a great day for the DGQC.
Why is that?
Because every day for the DGQC is a great day.
There we go. There we go. That works for me. That works for me. I'll ask, as I always do, please check our announcements section. Please check our ongoing readings and see what else we've got going. There's a lot happening and a lot of readings on the server. But for now, I'll go ahead and dive into capitalist representation. Writing has never been capitalism's thing. Capitalism is profoundly illiterate. The death of writing is like the death of God or the death of the Father. The thing was settled a long time ago, although the news of the event is slow to reach us, and there survives in us the memory of extinct signs with which we still write. The reason for this is simple. Writing implies a use of language in general according to which graphism becomes aligned on the voice, but also overcodes it and induces a fictitious voice from on high that functions as a signifier. The arbitrary nature of the thing designated, the subordination of the signified, the transcendence of the despotic signifier, and finally, its consecutive decomposition into minimal elements within a field of immanence, uncovered by the withdrawal of the despot. All this is evidence that writing belongs to imperial, despotic representation. Once this is said, what exactly is meant when someone announces the collapse of the Gutenberg galaxy? Of course, capitalism has made and continues to make use of writing. Not only is writing adapted to money as the general equivalent, but the specific functions of money in capitalism went by way of writing and printing, and in some measure continue to do so. The fact nonetheless remains that writing typically plays the role of an archaism, capitalism, the Gutenberg press being the element that confers on the archaism a current function. But the capitalist use of language is different in nature. It is realized or becomes concrete within the field of immanence peculiar to capitalism itself, with the appearance of the technical means of expression that correspond to the generalized decoding of flows, instead of still referring, in a direct or indirect form, to despotic overcoding. Great start. Let me share the PDF, make sure it's on the same page, quite literally. Let's see where to break down this one. Well, first we'll ask, does anyone have questions on this before I dive in and try to break down where I had issues my first times through this? Guess that's no. It's a fairly crisp paragraph talking through the shift that's making again pointing at the way that it was under the despot, where writing sort of took control of the voice, this element that also has this the designation, the despotic signifier, and the minimal elements within a field of eminence uncovered by the withdrawal of the despot, all these things that we've talked through representation of the despotic. The move into capital, we've kept these. These things are still working, but they aren't the forefront. This is not actually how representation really functions under capital. It's an early sort of version of that. JK, was that you? I heard jump
With
in.
Gutenberg galaxy, is that they mentioned that seemed to be like important idea.
I
forgot.
actually I don't know what it's a reference to. My guess is that it's a more of a it's a reference to the idea of the world of writing, like the printed word, the Gutenberg galaxy, as like a clever sort of name for it, is how I understood it. I spent time Googling that once upon a time, and I couldn't find anyone actually calling for the death or the end of the Gutenberg galaxy. So my guess is that it's more of a collective, interesting sort of comment from him.
Okay, thanks.
If anyone has any secondary thoughts on that, please.
I mean, I think you got it right. It's the way that the use of technical machines in a network is being reconfigured, right? So the death of God, the death of the Father, and now the death of the Gutenberg galaxy.
Yeah. The last bit here, the last sentence is the one that matters a great deal as we move to Mcluhan in the next paragraph, which I'll read in just a moment. But it's Mcluhan here, I think, that they're going to be referencing that's very important. The line being, the capitalist use of language as a sort of function itself, the capitalist use of language is different in nature. It is realized or becomes concrete within the field of eminence peculiar to capitalism itself, with the appearance of the technical means of expression that correspond to the generalized decoding of flows, instead of still referring in a direct or indirect form to despotic overcoding. Again, when we're in the despotic socius, the overcoding that gets played by everything is by the despot. Everything is ultimately controlled or in reference to the despot overcoding everything that's happening. But no longer is that the case. This is shifting. There's a move that is now about a generalized decoding of flows rather than one that is the despot demanding this be that or that, this or that. That makes sense. But with that, I'll continue to the next little bit here.
Can
Please.
I comment on that?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, to your point, right, overcoding's changing, right? So the imbrication process, the way in which bits of code are actually sort of like layered and stacked upon each other, is changing here, right? So like the Gutenberg press, the idea was that, or like the Gutenberg Bible, that books and literacy was able to spread so as to make the means of writing and reading um, sort of available to everybody, right? And that was a technical achievement in that, right? And we can think about what that means in terms of the spot socius. But like Brooks is getting at, right? Something's changing with capitalism, right? So something like a writing press as a technical machine is being reconfigured, right? And so when we look here at but the capitalist use of language is different in nature, right? The part that I wanted to focus on real quickly was the appearance of the technical means of expression that correspond to the generalized decoding of flows, instead of still referring in direct or indirect form to despotic overcoding. So one thing we can say here, right? Technical objects, especially in the production of subjectivity, but also the recording process, they're here not playing into the overcoding of the despot or the Erstat, right? We can even kind of contrast the use of the technical machines by capital with the despotic interplay of the Erstat, so as to overcode, whereas now we're talking about how writing itself is actually bound up in processes of decoding, which I think makes the illiteracy point kind of nicely, right? It's not so much that people can't read or write here per se. I think their point is more so that The very act of writing, the very use of language and codes are themselves in processes of decoding, as opposed to that layering we were just talking about.
Yeah, and it's again the reason and the means and what makes people do things. When we're talking about despotic overcoding, it's the thing we're ultimately doing, and it's for the despot, or it's for my alliances or affiliations under the primitive, or what those come to be under the despot, which is the despot. And it's this ends of it all that things become sort of overcoded as that it's for the despot, it's for God and country, it's for Caesar. Render under Caesar what is Caesar's kind of thing. But this shift that's happening now is the removal of that, is the removal of this ends, is the removal of, as they sort of phrase it here very specifically, it's a generalized decoding of flows. Because again, we're talking about, as we've been talking about production, the shift of production and how it works versus the primitive versus the despotic. In the primitive, production is immanent almost to the real. I'm doing what I'm doing. It's inscribed upon me. It's a very harsh world of demands of what I do. Under despotic, the orders come down from on high, and I do what I do, but it's not the whole thing isn't necessarily matched to. I'm getting an echo from somebody. The whole thing isn't necessarily matched to, like, oh, I'm doing production literally because of this or that. It's all in line with it, but now we've made this shift, and suddenly, like, production is matched to it. How to put it? The system of production and anti-production are immanent to each other now, and as such, representation takes a significant shift. But we're about to get into that. I'll kind of just dive ahead. I shouldn't be skipping. This seems for us to be the significance in Mcluhan's analysis, to have shown what a language of decoded flows is, as opposed to a signifier that strangles and overcodes the flows. In the first place, for non-signifying language, anything will do, whether it be phonic, graphic, gestural, etc. No flow is privileged in this language, which remains indifferent to its substance or its support, inasmuch as the latter is an amorphous continuum. The electric flow can be considered as the realization of such a flow that is indeterminate as such. But a substance is said to be formed when a flow enters into a relationship with another flow, such that the first defines a content and the second an expression. The deterritorialized flows of content and expression are in a state of conjunction or reciprocal precondition that constitutes figures as the ultimate units of both content and expression. These figures do not derive from a signifier, nor are they even signs as minimal elements of the signifier. They are non-signs, or rather non-signifying signs. Point signs having several dimensions, flows breaks or schizzes that form images through their coming together in a whole, but that do not maintain any identity when they pass from one whole to another. Hence the figures, that is, the schizzes or breaks flows, are in no way figurative. They become figurative only in a particular constellation that dissolves in order to be replaced by another one. 3 million points per second transmitted by television, only a few of which are retained. Electric language does not go by way of the voice of writing. Data processing does without them both, as does that discipline appropriately named fluidic, which operates by means of streams of gas. The computer is a machine for instantaneous and generalized decoding. The Shelseris defines in this sense the correlation of the break and flow in the signs of the new technical language of machines, where production is narrowly determined by information. Take, for example, a cloverleaf highway interchange. It is a quasi-point that analyses, through multiple overlappings, along a dimension that is normal to the network space, the lines of flow for which it serves as a receiver. On it, one can go from any afferent direction to any efferent direction, and in whatever order, without ever encountering any of the other direction. If I like, I will never come back to the same point, although it will be the same, a topological knot where everything is connected without confusion, where everything flows together and is distributed. Thus, a knot may be seen as a point having several dimensions, which, far from canceling the flows, contains them and sets them in motion. This cordoning off of production through information shows once again that the productive essence of capitalism functions or speaks only in the language of signs imposed on it by merchant capital or the axiomatic, the market. To read the Mcluhan quote he references here at the bottom from Understanding the Media, which I recommend as reading for anyone. The electric light is pure information. It is a medium without a message, as it were, unless it is used to spell out some verbal ad or name. This fact, characteristic of all media, means that the content of any medium is always another medium. The content of writing is speech, just as the written word is the content of print. Print, the content of the telegraph. There's a lot here. First, any top line thoughts before we start breaking down this entire paragraph?
Yeah, I looked up Marsh McLuhan's. He wrote a book called The Gutenberg Galaxy, and he divides history into 4 epochs: oral tribe culture, manuscript culture, and then the third one is Gutenberg Galaxy.
He actually wrote, God damn it, of course he did.
The last one is that electronic age. Yeah, this one he's talking about here, I guess. So I guess we're in the electronic age, right? It coincides with capitalism.
Well, and this is one of the hallmarks of capitalism, right? So it's not, like we said a few sessions ago, right? It's not simply reducible to money, right? It is also the machinery of it all, right? That if you do your economic analysis, right, the machines or the means of production, right, is going to be sort of the hallmark of capitalism, not just for Marxian thought, but for economic thought in general. So yeah, I guess that would line up almost creepily.
So it looks like his reference for Gutenberg Galaxy, God damn it. I feel like I thought I had looked this up. References a great deal of Finnegan's Wake. And so his reference is basically to an intertextuality of a Gutenberg Galaxy, the way that they're all touching into things. And apparently Shakespeare's King Lear would be second place, the other thing he talks about. But a quote from it is, throughout Finnegan's Wake, Joyce specifies the Tower of Babel as the Tower of Sleep, that is the Tower of the Witless Assumption, or what Bacon calls the Reign of the Idiot. It's a play through all of that. And the book everyone's familiar with Mcluhan is the book The Medium is the Message, which is also a saying that kind of has come out of that is said quite often without people really thinking through what it means. But the medium of the message, to read just straight out of Wikipedia, it's a great line, is that new technologies like alphabets, printing presses, speech itself, exert a gravitational effect on cognition, which in turn affects social organization. Print technology changes our perceptual habits, the visual homogenizing of experience, which in turn affects social interactions, which fosters a mentality that gradually resists but a specialist outlook overall. According to Mcluhan, the advent of print technology contributed to and made possible most of the salient threads in the modern period of the Western world. For Mcluhan, these trends all reverberate with print technology's principle of segmentation of actions and functions and principle of visual quantification. Wonderful. Carried through, I think, pretty nicely here by D&G. Thanks for that, JK. Glad you're Googling stuff. I wish I had Googled that. God damn it, I feel dumb.
No, it's okay. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to clarify, my own understanding, because I seem to I've heard it before, but then and then when you look into it, because I haven't read Marsh McLuhan that much, just.
Just real quick, because I think it's also worth mentioning, The idea of content and expression also stems from, and this is where I first got into, thanks to Kent, who hasn't joined us today, is Yelmslev, where content and expression are essentially his algebra of the way language works. The Prolegomena of Language is the book. Phenomenal, interesting read. And a lot of that that Deleuze and Mcluhan are pulling from comes from his writing, for sure. I'll link to it. Give me a moment. Link to it. Please turn and please type away.
Sorry, I'm slow. But I mean, I was just going to type about the interesting part up at the top of the paragraph on how non-signs come together to form images.
And this is, I think it's worth us spending a moment on that, because this whole thing is sort of a really fast journey all the way through a lot of Mcluhan stuff, but Yelmslev stuff sort of to bring us quickly through it. So yeah, let's jump in there. His words in the first place. For non-signifying language, anything will do, whether it be phonic, graphic, gestural, etc. No flow is privileged in this language, which remains indifferent to its substance or its support, inasmuch as the latter is an amorphous continuum. The electric flow can be considered as a realization of such a flow that is indeterminate as such. But a substance is said to be formed when a flow enters into a relationship with another flow, and that the first defines a content and the second an expression. Whew, lot said there. The way a gestural or a graphic language or phonic pre-language, as he may describe, or a lot of what we sort of experience in terms of language, has these very, very tiny parts. Yelmslev very much broke this down. I linked to it. I linked to a really great sort of version of his way that he sees how signs function and how he sort of plays off of Saussure, but also sort of marries into him. The way signs work with him is that they have an expression and content. Like, just to be very specific here, to quote, a sign function exists between absolutely inseparable terminals. For terminals constituting a sign function, sign expression, size content, Yelmslev gives the technical name of functives. This idea of these little base layers of elements. For anyone who's in our other reading group for logic of sense, you may be thinking of the same thing when it comes to points or aleatory points or singularity. These are very much what he's talking about here. They're all the elements of what make the communication or the thing, the phonic, the graphic, these little bits. Rock, paper, scissors. Sign language is another great one. There's no flow that is privileged in this language, just the actual elements when it is purely non-signifying in and of itself. When it becomes signifying, there's a shift, and that is when these two flows sort of hit. The flow of content and the flow of expression. And the way that they play together is ultimately how we sort of have these moments of generating meaning. It's a very short version, but I mean, all of Logic of Sense feels like it's kind of a version of this too. These flows of content and expression, to quote again, are in a state of conjunction or reciprocal precondition that constitutes figures as the ultimate units of both content and expression. These figures do not derive from a signifier, nor are they even signs as minimal elements of the signifier. They are non-signs, non-signifying signs, points signs, having several dimensions, flows, breaks, and skizzes that form images through their coming together in a whole. I would highly recommend, soon I'll be putting all of it up. I would recommend Logic of Sense for this. Proust and Signs would be another one where Deleuze is getting deeper into his semiotics here, I think. But if anyone wants to jump in and talk through this, this is pointing at that. It feels like this is pointing at Logic of Sense, especially our most recent reading.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Logic of Sense. You can definitely compare the coordination of semiotics for effects, right? How they communicate. with the point signs that are established through the signifying chains in that, right? Or just on the BWO in general. But to move into here in this paragraph, right, we're getting a really important ontological remark, right? We're getting what is a decoded flow, right? How does that function in this system, right? So again, why is it, this joke about capitalism being illiterate, right? Part of the joke is it's not used in signification, right? Or at least for our purposes right now, decoded flows aren't used in signification. We're talking about this bifold plane of content and expression, right? So if we walk this into here, and some of the sentences Brooks was looking at, right? I mean, I think the electric flow actually gives it quite a nice image, but even in the construction of images, right? It's not producing words for us to work under semiotics, right? So you're not going from a marking to some sort of mental content, right? As in like normal Saussurian semiotics. We're instead seeing how decoded flows actually push us into this question of not only the medium, right, but of form and of content and expression.
And a great deal of this is important to also bring into context the previous two chapters as we talk through what the paralogisms do, how they affect us, how they play into the creation of the subject, and how representation works within that. This is incredibly important to keep that in mind as we talk through the actual meaning of these little bits, their ability to come together as a whole, but do not maintain identity when they pass from one form to another. Hence, the figures, the schizzes, break flows are not figurative. They become figurative only in a particular constellation that dissolves in order to be replaced by another one. We'll be getting more into that. He then outlines a handful of great examples of this. I think were he alive today, he would probably have a shitload more of examples, given us living in the information age, or whatever we want to call the internet and social media these days, or meme culture. Meme culture itself feels like a version of this as well, for sure. Also, I recommend highly Michel Serres, a wonderful author.
And I also think it's key to point out constellation there. I thought that's really interesting because, they say the same thing about Oedipus being a constellation, that it only like makes sense as a structure with context of the father, mother, and the child. Because, of course, any particular one of those things taken by itself could not signify the same thing, right?
Well, it's
So, yeah.
perfect point. No, you're spot on, Tiernan. It's 100% about making sure that you have all of the points. That's what generates the thing. The same way that if the Big Dipper was missing one of those stars, we wouldn't see it the same way. The use of constellation is very intentional, for sure. Sign and structure. Yep.
Well, and let's split this into I'm going to use the rock, paper, scissors to make the point, right? Because we want to get at what do decoded flows do here in this kind of semiotics, right? So I posted a picture that my buddy Dr. Tim gave me. I don't know where he found it, probably the internet, but so your point about the constellation, right, is how we're going to get the substance, right? So flows in the conjunction. So right, and again, the third synthesis, the production of subjectivity, and the consummation of it right there. So with the substance, right, we can kind of understand that through like the rock, paper, scissors game, right? Where the conjunction of flows provides us a substance. So if you compare that with a hand, right, you've got fingers, you've got the capacity for the hand to bend, you've got joints, right? You've got these different things that give you the substance of the hand through the relationships, and that provides you a substance of expression. Within the context of rock, paper, scissors, right, you have possible content, right? So this isn't so much about rock meaning something. This is about the content of a certain expression, right? So here that the rock is possible by moving your hand in a certain way. That paper is possible, right? Which is kind of like, instead of thinking about what it means, right? It kind of puts it, or at least if we do think about what it means, it's not so much the mental and normal signification way, which if you go back to form, right? So the hand can move in those forms that we call rock, so, paper, and scissors, right? And from there you move into the way in which the form of the content is going to give you the game of rock, paper, scissors through the way that those combinations have their own relationships, right? So if we put that into these decoded flows, I think the point they're trying to make here is that if it's not a signifying language for like Saussurian purposes, right, then we're talking about how decoded flows, if I understand correctly, basically establish something like the rock, paper, scissors game.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the key distinction here would be that there's an actual material sign for Deleuze and Guattari, that being the flow.
Well, and that takes us to the allegory they use, or, well, they quote Saris is using, the highway interchange, the clover interchange, which is by today's standards almost quaint in how it uses it, but I still like the use of it because we're talking about the ability for us to insert ourselves into an interchange and come out from any other direction multiple times, perhaps, never crossing the same space exactly, never having that same direction. The way that an interchange works very much becomes how meaning is effectively generated as well, or how I find meaning, perhaps, from how flows move in and out of these elements. At least that's how I read it, the bit. I really love that analogy.
Yeah, so again, right, we're moving from the mental aspect of the despotic and the erstat through the stacking of codes to, like you're saying, right, there's a way in which the decoded flows are actually producing this these sort of games, if you like, for lack of a better word.
Anybody familiar with Guy Debord, as French writer from the, I think from the 50s? He wrote a book called The Spectacle of the Society. I put his name there. I put something, some quotes in the chat. The spectacle is capital accumulated to the point that it becomes images. So, you know, is Deleuze saying that that images replace language in a way?
That language shifts. That when we're talking about language under the despot, and this is part of the way writing works and how writing and voice, graphism and phonism become one, ultimately the voice, well, supposedly being in charge, really the written word begins to own it, how it functions, how it works. That sort of next push, the sort of next thing that happens within Capital is that we move away from effectively having what we might say as a concerted language or a top-down despot who's saying, here's what these words mean, or here's the meaning generated, or what we're pointing at when we do stuff. And instead, I would not say images directly, but that the elements within things and the constellation of them are what generate our meaning within our language now. And it's through image, it's through it's through network effects, it's through social requirements, it's through production. All of these things become immanent to each other.
Right.
The line he has, I like, it ends it, it's this cordoning off of production through information shows once again that the productive essence of capitalism functions or speaks only in the language of signs imposed on it by merchant capital or the axiomatic of the market. And that kind of, I think, is where they're making the point of the essentially boiling everything down to its elements and having, like we were talking about a moment ago, the constellation of these things.
Is also a reduction process that leads to maybe an emphasis on ordinary language, you know, like the Wittgenstein's language games, so that you can't even, with ordinary language, there's no need to do any philosophy or think any, deeper beyond what ordinary language is. That's the reality, right?
But I think they're working on a different way, right? Because I mean, you're spot on. Language is changing here altogether, right? And this point about literacy, I think, really makes it because instead of referencing what are the stacks of codes that make meaning possible in the society, right? So the codification of a flow being this imbricative process and finding meaning in those stackings, we're seeing how um, there is a production of, oh, that's good enough. Um, there's a production through the decoded flows in this non-signifying way, which means we're not going to be dealing with reference to those mental capacities, which is normally one way we think of writing, that we're thinking of the mind sort of accessing these cognitive ideas about things, right? Instead, we're seeing how the flows themselves are actually conjuncting, right? So we get that third synthesis again to produce expression, right? Or these forms and contents where, and this is one of the interesting moves I think they're really making here, right? Things are being produced now um, without reference to that signification. So all these machines and flows at the conjunct to produce the subject are producing them in a similar way that rock, paper, scissors works, right? Without reference to a mental capacity, but actually in reference to this kind of, I guess I'm going to stick with the word game here.
Well,
So
I would real quick, Jack, because let's pull back because to me, how I'm understanding it is they're talking about basically the shift towards the flows being the thing that's ultimately now not even generating meaning, but that is kind of coming together to create those moments. But like the flows and how they work is now the important part. Before we had graphism, we had these things that pointed at stuff or had meaning or at some point would, become stone for the great wall that we were building, or the goods that would be created. We'd have too many chairs and we'd have to have a surplus feast or destruction of them, like the accursed share conception. But now under capital, because we're now talking about flows being able to become anything, and then essentially the ephemerality, it's the fog that things can be, where they can be anything. They can enter the intersection this way, come out the other way. The flows, and as they hit, the knot that's created has meaning, but that meaning suddenly itself is something that then travels and is produced. And all of it, because again, all this is happening up against sort of production itself. That's one of the things that sort of has shifted big time. Now, meaning, the only reason meaning matters is if we're producing surplus value in meaning. And so as such, like all of these things start pushing towards that. The conjunctions themselves have to have consistent pushing surplus value, and that's the flows coming together. And so the surplus value is the connection of content and expression now playing the same role that just things have to in capital in general, all flows.
Yeah. So meaning is being replaced by maybe perhaps capitalistic monetary value.
I don't even know about monetary value. I just, in general, surplus value.
So it's the affiliative and the alliance still, right? It's your
Yes.
D of X over D of Y. Because the thing about this Ishmael ontology is that it's going to be, how do you get the surplus value of flux? Well, things are still possible under certain conditions, right? We've got the second synthesis and affiliative and alliant. But the way that that's going to be able to express and provide content is therefore going to be limited not only in the production of subjectivity, but in the way of that being a decoded flow, that remains sort of this production of flux or excess flux.
Yes. I think I agree. Yes. It's a big push for us that we're now talking about these flows, though, because flows under capitalism, generally speaking, are going to be deeply regulated, and the conjunctions, as we've talked about in the previous one, this conjunction, the moment of that thing, this is where capitalism sits on that conjunction. This is where we sit, is like value sits, whatever it may be. This is where surplus value is created. This happens in all flows, and that would include that of what we would consider to be language or conversation or whatever. Again, memes is a phenomenal example of this. The way that the only meaning that they now generate is the constellation of meaning of that which has also come before, the conjunctions that have followed up prior to that, whether it be this image or piecemeal thing with this other piecemeal bit of text, this other reference from Family Guy mixed with this other philosophical book, all of these things sort of coming together in this meme that's immediately ephemeral and also tossed out because the flows are constantly moving and having to produce surplus value. They lose meaning themselves. It's more the meaning they generate, which then generates further other memes that are constantly creating and building and going and going and going. And so this nature and shift from even under the despotic, where A means water, that's the end of the conversation. And well, that was bad enough under the despotic because it created sort of the slave nature of the way language works. This allows this sort of never-ending continuous movement forward of content and expression in ways that are constantly able to move. And they talk through the technical language machines where production is narrowly determined by information, and they go through the rest of that. And I think all of us can talk about ways that that works within our own sort of lives or our own world that is not, it's not a reach for me to talk about that, I don't think. It's that line, a knot may be seen as a point having several dimensions, and which, far from canceling the flows, contains them and sets them in motion. This cordoning off of production through information shows once again the productive essence of capitalism functions or speaks only in the language of signs imposed on it by merchant capital or the axiomatic of the market. And the axiomatic of the market is that of surplus value. The need for that. Am I far off? Varun? Anyone?
Well, the axiomats of the market, those can vary, right? But the production of surplus value flux, that's what the socius is doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the axiomatics, I mean, we kind of used the Weberian ones last year when we talked about this, right? Because it's just kind of the easy example. But they kind of provide a foundation for signification, right? That's kind of the interesting thing going on here is you still seem to get some aspect of speaking going on. And something like an axiomatic seems to at least provide you, or rather provide capital, that that function, right? The language of signs imposed on by merchant capital or the axiomatic of the market, right? So like if I'm not mistaken, the Alliant and even the axiomatic actually seem to produce some signifying, I guess that'd be articulation that makes possible for capital or for decoded flows in capital, right?
I think that's fair. Yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking about the other side of this, that because there's that lack of signification, it means everything is deeply abstracted, like everyone and everything as part of it. Because again, to boil it down and to go back, it's about the flows or the flux, these elements and their conjunction. And this doesn't apply just to hey, we have investment over here and we're able to, through a conjunction, make a business and the profits stonks go high, yay, GameStop. But instead, this applies to all flows and fluxes under capital, which would include these flows and fluxes that he's outlining here. And these point signs that become the elements or the dimensions where there are the flows, breaks, or schizzes that form images through their coming together in a whole, but do not maintain any identity when they pass from one whole to another. Hence the figures, the schizzes, are in no way figurative. They become figurative only in a particular constellation that dissolves in order to be replaced by another one. The wonderful piece that sort of points in that direction. Any thoughts, any opinions before I move on to the next paragraph? I don't want to kind of harp on this because I think a lot of what I'm saying is also in the next little bits here. I probably shouldn't have had so much coffee this morning.
You never need to apologize for drinking too much coffee, only too little.
Mm-hmm. I've had those days too. Last notes, JK, Varun, anyone?
Yeah, so these kind of he's talking about the like the identities and so forth. So this kind of relates to in the previous books his use of the terms common sense and good sense. So in this kind of this kind of socius, adapting to that socius means that it's a kind of becomes the good sense and common sense, right, in this capitalist system.
Yeah, I mean, good sense and common sense. I think the most clearest definition of that's actually like chapter 3 of difference and repetition, right? Good sense implies that we work backwards from a presupposed teleology, and common sense implies that because we work backwards from a presupposed teleology, we subsume all these differences into a commonality and ignore the non-unity between these concepts. I'm still a bit confused on how it would apply, but it seems like an interesting connection.
Well, I think it would be how I would respond is I would say I don't think necessarily we're talking in capitalism of good sense and common sense in the way that, because I think a lot of Deleuze is referring to Kant, and I don't think necessarily under capital we have the same versions of those things, but instead the axiomatics that get generated under capital have a function that isn't wildly different from that. A sort of, hey, here's how things are done, or here's what matters, or here's why. Those things, those axiomatics become built into capital and have maybe not exactly the same sort of function, but they sort of take up a space that may seem similar. Is that fair, Varun?
So my interpretation, at least, I guess my guess would be we could find examples of good sense and common sense in the paralogistic ways we might interpret capitalism. Specifically about, you can give examples like reification. That could be an example of common sense, and good sense could be an example of, I don't know, implying that implying something like that the market has a teleology or something like that. That eventually there'll be a revolution, blah blah blah. So I guess good sense and common sense would be applicable if we misunderstand the genetic account of capitalism, and then in misunderstanding the genetic account of capitalism, we paralogistically appropriate what capitalism is, and specifically things they're critiquing, and that would be the example of where good sense and common sense lies, specifically in the misinterpretation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's the way under capital, a bedrock layer of this is the way things are, which maybe under the despotic good sense and common sense may make a little bit more sense. It's a terrible sentence. I shouldn't be allowed to talk to people. The under capital, it's the network of the things that came before that worked. This axiomatic that continually kind of moves forward and keeps pushing, and the way that things and images sort of layer on top of each other, which I think actually again, value and how it's defined here is the next paragraph. And I think I'm going to just jump to that because it's a long paragraph. Any questions specifically on this, the wording inside of this paragraph, maybe not the ideas, which I think we can wait a little bit and get to that, but specifically in anywhere, questions on sentence or structure or anything that's in this specific paragraph? Okay. There are great differences between such a linguistics of flows and linguistics of the signifier. Saussurian linguistics, for example, in effect discovers a field of eminence constituted by value, i.e. by the system of relations among ultimate elements of the signifier, but apart from the fact that this field of eminence still presupposes the transcendence of a signifier, which uncovers the field if only through the signifier's own withdrawal. The elements populating this field have, for a criterion, a minimal identity that they owe to their relations of opposition, that they keep throughout all the types of variation affecting them. The elements of the signifier as distinguishing units are regulated by coded gaps that the signifier overcodes in its turn. There results diverse but always convergent consequences. The comparison of language to a game, the signified-signifier relationship, where the signified finds itself by nature subordinated to the signifier. Figures defined as effects of the signifier itself, the formal elements of the signifier determined in relation to a phonic substance on which writing even confers a secret privilege. We believe that, from all points of view and despite certain appearances, Louis Hjelmslev's linguistics stands in profound opposition to the Saussurian and post-Saussurian undertaking, because it abandons all privileged reference, because it describes a pure field of algebraic immanence that no longer allows any surveillance on the part of a transcendent instance, even one that has withdrawn, because within this field it sets in motion its flows of form and substance, content, expression, because it substitutes the relationship of reciprocal precondition between expression and content for the relationship of subordination between signifier and signified, because there no longer occurs a double articulation between two hierarchized levels of language, but between two convertible, deterritorialized planes, constituted by the relation between the form of the content and the form of expression. Because in this relation, one reaches figures that are no longer effects of a signifier, but schizzes, point signs, or flows breaks that collapse the wall of the signifier, pass through, and continue on beyond, because these signs have crossed a new threshold of deterritorialization, because these figures have definitively lost the minimum conditions of identity that defined the elements of the signifier itself, because in Hjelmslev's linguistics, the order of the elements is secondary in relation to the axiomatic of flows and figures, because the money model in the point sign or in the figure break, stripped of its identity, having now only a floating identity, tends to replace the model of the game. In short, Hjelmslev's very special position in linguistics and the reactions he provokes seem to be explained by the following: that he tends to fashion a purely immanent theory of language that shatters the double game of the voice graphism domination, that causes form and substance, content and expression to flow according to the flows of desire, and that breaks these flows according to point signs and figures, schizzes. Far from being an overdetermination of structuralism and of its fondness for the signifier, Hjelmslev's linguistics implies the concerted destruction of the signifier and constitutes a decoded theory of language about which one can also say, an ambiguous tribute, that it is the only linguistics adapted to the nature of both the capitalist and the schizophrenic flows, until the now the only modern and not archaic theory of language. To read the footnote, Nicholas Ruet, for example, takes Hjelmslev to task for having elaborated a theory whose applications are on the order of Jabberwocky or Finnegan's Wake introduction to Le Grammaire Générative. André Martinet stresses the loss of the conditions of identity in Hjelmslev's theory. I'm not going to read the French part. so as not to insult anyone who speaks French. There's a lot in this paragraph. There's so much. I actually don't know where to start. Anyone, please jump in. I'm going to take a second.
So this is kind of what we were just talking about, right? It's the difference between the Saussurian use of the signifier and signified, and then obviously like the implications for the referent. It's like to go from that into form and into expression and content. You can never break that habit, right? So this is the expansion of why, and arguably the justification too, why they're using Heshmel to understand not only schizophrenic.
Yelmslev.
You can't be talking ever since you said Simon Don.
I did.
So now we know Brutz is
Oh God.
his forte is not French. It's, what is this, Danish? Swedish, right?
It's Danish. It doesn't matter.
So Yesmel. Yeah, oh, man.
Yesmel. There we go.
Oh, there we go. So this is the difference, right? They're moving out of Saussure, which may have been applicable for the despotic and for maybe in some sense the primitive, although not exactly, right? But anyways, to move from that into Esmel and where his theory of semiotics is actually applicable because it's going to help us understand how decoded flows actually coordinate through expression and content, right?
I mean, if we break it down from the very beginning, right? Value is a thing that Saussure actually builds up. It's one of his concepts, right? That a sign within the language structure, within the lang, each sign has a specific value, which is tied to its position in the linguistic structure. And the field of immanence that's being referred to is, I think it's a very interesting reading that Deleuze and Guattari have of structuralism. Because I think they do believe to a certain extent that the lang in structuralism constitutes a field of immanence. So I guess the simple way to explain this is, right, language works only by the relations it has with other words. And for Deleuze and Guattari, that itself is a field of immanence. So in a weird way, they're actually agreeing with the structuralists here, whether you like it or not. But in that sense, the field of immanence would be the relationship between words that constitute the word's value. So, and in other words, that's saying, a word only gets its meaning through not being the other word. And another word for the field of immanence would be the lang. So, of course, this is what they mean by the system of relations among ultimate elements of the signifier. And essentially, then, that would be the way of talking about expression, the part that the whole of the signification system is greater than its parts, and in that sense, the words are defined by these relations. But then they'll talk about, if you go into the next page, they'll talk about that presupposition of the transcendence that they owe to their relations. And that's where Hemschlev, they see the solution with Hemschlev to remove the primacy of the signifier and to bring back the primacy of the lang over the signifier. So to put the relations before the word in a way.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a great way to put it. The relations before the word, before any of it. That's, again, to go back to the idea of the constellation of meaning that these things have. It's very much it. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so I don't know if, I'd be curious what other people think of this. I mean, personally, I think Deleuze has a big affinity for structuralism, especially people like Levi-Strauss. Well, not Levi-Strauss, Saussure and stuff, because he pays a lot of homage to them in the fourth chapter of Difference and Repetition. He also talks about structuralist mathematics, but he really does take a lot from the structuralists. Like, he takes their premises pretty seriously, and It's not. Yeah, there's a tendency in Deleuze scholarship to forget this, that Deleuze was actually very sympathetic to the structuralists. Like, he took a lot of influence from them.
Well, I don't think Deleuze. What did I say in a Logic of Sense reading? Because we were talking about that, and then his writing. I think he has a writing on structuralism, but it's Deleuze hits this weird point where he's not quite anti-structuralist, although I wouldn't call him structuralist, and he's in a unique position when it comes to his relations to them, almost as if he was sort of wanting to occupy the place within structural semiotics that he believes meaning does as a floating point, sort of floating identity amongst.
Yeah, I mean, there are too many coincidences for me to point out that the similarity between the long and the virtual have, except that there's a genetic account that structuralism fails to provide, which Deleuze will provide. In logical sense, this is the difference between a dynamic genesis and a static genesis. Deleuze will provide this, where the structuralists can't provide this genetic account, and that's what separates Deleuze, in my opinion. But it's still a very interesting comparison to be drawn. There's not many papers written about it, sadly.
Well, and there's something to be said for the use of the second synthesis there too, right? In terms of inclusion and exclusion, because so like you mentioned earlier, part of structuralism for Saussure is like the negative relations of difference, right? This word is not that word, so therefore that word, so therefore the former can mean this, right? Because it's not these other things. And so when I think of what's going on here with Yezhov and that, one of the things that I can't help but think is that if you're working from the point of this immanent field in that, but particularly through the precondition, as they call it, the reciprocal precondition, as they call it actually, of content and expression, then you're going to have to be in a position of affirmation, right? Where the negation is not going to be what's constitutive, but more so something like configuration through what's possible is going to end up being what ultimately will produce your semiotics, right? I would say that's kind of the move I'm thinking there.
Yeah, I mean, for Deleuze, affirmation is presupposed when the question of genesis is asked through production rather than possibility. In that sense, you already affirm it. You affirm the dice throw. I mean, that structuralist essay is really interesting, because I think one thing that I find hilarious about that essay is he defines structuralism, almost like playing a joke at it. He defines structuralism in a negative way, right? So, we can only we get for Saussure, right? The meaning of a word is defined through what it is not. For Deleuze's notion of structuralism in his essay, he defines structuralism through what it is not. So it's pretty brilliant, actually.
That also seems to be what he's kind of moving away from, especially here with Guattari and him using this Yezmelvian, that's not important, this Yezmelvian conception of language, right? And I hate to shift the conversation, but it looks like Brooks wants to get back into the text, and I can never say no to getting back into the text.
No, I just real quick, I just think it might be a good idea, just because it helps, especially as we move into this next bit with Leotard. If anyone wants to give a top line on what his critique is here or what he's critiquing, because we've kind of taken it for granted that everyone's on the same page, who's listening, who's got a grasp maybe of what master signifier means, or signifier, signification, or any of that. Does anyone want to give a top line in it, or even structuralism or post-struct? Anyone? Varun?
On master signifier?
Or structuralism and post-struct. Just specifically signifier is what I want to spend a little bit of time on, because we're about to get into that with Leotard, and I think it's worthwhile.
So the basic understanding of what a signifier is that what you're asking?
Just like a rudimentary version, so that way anyone who's maybe too embarrassed to say, I don't know what the fuck these guys are talking about at all, can finally have a hat, a hook to hang their hat on.
Well, I gotta respect somebody who didn't know about signifiers and entered the school. It's very hard to read Deleuze without signifiers, but for Saussure, what I basically said earlier was that the phrase tree has no internal relation to the concept tree, but neither does it refer to any real tree in the world. It's simply tied to the notion of tree by virtue of the fact that it's the only word that there are no other words that refer to tree. So it's through the negation of all the other words that tree and the word tree are connected. So the word tree would be the signifier. I don't know. I'll give the master signifier stuff to somebody else to do. I'm not that good at that.
I can give that a shot, because it's going to move from Saussure into Lacan, right? But like the master signifier, the spot signifier, if I remember correctly, this is basically going to get into not only the first paralogism, but basically a lot of the Lacanian subject, right? So in the first synthesis, you have things coming together through the establishment of flows and breaks, right? Connections are being established, relationships are being produced. And the signifying chain is part of that, right? So this is kind of that, like we're seeing here, this is that ability for the flow to actually not only be productive, but allow for the machine to produce through the flow, right? That reciprocation. So this is where you're getting the point signs is going to be that signifying chain, if I remember correctly. And so, at least for Deleuze and Guattari, I believe that's what's going on, just in that isolation. If I remember correctly, for Lacan, he's going to say that like the thing that you want, right, within the discourse. I think the discourse is S2, which for our purposes is just the relations of different signs, right? Is going to need to be represented. And then this is going to be issue 2, is the subject itself is also going to need to be represented, right? So the thing that's desired is going to be represented through, I believe it's S1, but the master signifier.
So, sort of. The master signifier is the kind of comment would be, we find meaning and signification through reference to other bits. If anyone's been in our language or logic of sense reading, Deleuze deeply goes into how signification insists upon other signification. It, as a word, signifies a lot of things, but it is just it. A master signifier is the end of that. At some point, we need to halt it, and a master signifier is that which imbues other things with meaning, but has none itself. An example Zizek uses commonly is capital or money. Money gets valued as money. That's it. Money is valued in and of itself, but it doesn't have value itself. Money doesn't do that. But commodities, shares, the internet, subscription services, video games, all have a value inscribed in money. They're all worth some amount of money. And that's the master signifier. The master signifier is that thing that itself references itself quite often, generally, but has no value itself, but other things insist upon it for value. And it's a very specific sort of derivation of Caesarean structural linguistics that Lacan runs with. God, the good sense actually is one of those as well. The law is just the law. The law does I do it because it's the law. That master signifier. These kinds of things are how we derive meaning from some thing on high. This is not at all what Deleuze and Guattari are going at. In fact, their critique is of all of these things. I just wanted to spend just a moment to go over that because I know the people who do listen to us on the end, and I get their messages and questions. So once upon a time, I was the person who was the person embarrassed asking questions because I was dumb as shit. And didn't understand any of this. I'm still dumb as shit, but now I understand some of it. So there we go. So I try to be that person still. But I wanted to go over that because I want to dive right into the next paragraph, which is about Leotard. The extreme importance of J.F. Leotard's recent book is due to its position as the first generalized critique of the signifier. In his most general proposition, in fact, he shows that the signifier is overtaken toward the outside by figurative images, just as it is overtaken toward the inside by the pure figures that compose it, or, more decisively, by the figural that comes to short circuit the signifier's overcoded gaps, inserting itself between them and working under the conditions of identity of their elements. In language and in writing itself, sometimes the letters as breaks, as shattered partial objects, and sometimes the words as undivided flows, as non-decomposable blocks, or full bodies having a tonic value, constitute a signifying signs that deliver themselves over to the order of desire, rushes of breath and cries. In particular, formal investigations concerning manual or printed writing change their meaning according to whether the characteristics of the letters and the quality of the words are in the service of the signifier, whose effects they express following exegetical rules, or whether, on the contrary, they break through this wall so as to set flows in motion and establish breaks that overflow or rupture the sign's conditions of identity and that cause books within the book to flow and to disintegrate, entering into multiple configurations whose possibilities were already the object of the typographical exercises of Mcluhan, always passing underneath the signifier, filing through the wall, which again shows that the death of writing is infinite, so long as it arises and arrives from within. Someone want to take this paragraph? I'm not.
I suppose it's getting at the thing that we kind of left off on with the Guy Debord reference, right? So if we're dealing with the construction of images, right, this kind of schizophrenic aspect of language in this Melvian system, then we're watching. So we're not working with like what do things mean in reference to like the mental, like we said. We're working with the production of images, right, which is kind of an interesting way of thinking about language and words, right? So in that sense, Leotard here is giving us how. So one, those images are actually subverting signification of that, or more directly, like the Saussurian model. So now we're not just seeing how Hishmel is a replacement for that or an alternative. We're seeing that it actually does something to signification, which is going to take us into like the other two socii, right? Because now we're seeing how signification, right, so signifier in the primitive, and more recently the signified and the despotic, is actually being subverted through the creation of these images. This again expands on their point that capital is illiterate, not because it's incapable of reading, but because that normal sense of like cognitive reference to something mental is being actually completely undermined here, right, and subverted through language and construction of images or figures.
See, I think this is them again talking about the way we come to the productive aspect of the long, because the long only takes you that far for Saussure. There's a reason why Saussure has to stop somewhere and doesn't give an account of Genesis, because it's very difficult for him to. For Deleuze and Guattari, the solution is to go through materiality, that being, Hemschlag, the fact that you have a material substance that's being altered through significations and blah blah blah. So I think what they're doing with Leotard is doing the same thing, except they're bringing things like partial objects here, and they're saying, because you can look at partial objects as being, when you understand the confection of partial objects, specifically from like Melanie Klein and stuff, you can look at them as also aspects of signification. For example, I'm a child, and my mother's breasts are no longer there to give me milk, and I desire milk. So what do? Well, I construct an object. I construct a partial object out of my mouth, and detect it in the form of sucking other things. That's an example of the construction of a sign in a way.
Yeah, I think I can see that because the point that I want to tie to that is that, right, or more decisively by the so-called figural, that comes to short circuit the signifier's coded gaps, inserting itself between them and working on the condition of identity of their elements. So yeah, they're definitely drawing in the partial objects in terms of language and that, right? So they're working in the first synthesis, but they're also, I think, and I think this is what your example is showing, the way in which codification, the signifiers there, um, would be present, right, through codes and overcoding, is encountering decoded flows whose images are actually subverting the codes that are there, right? So just like you're saying, right, the reconstitution of a function in terms of a new configuration also comes with the subversion of or it could come with the subversion of a code, particularly like in relation to signifiers, as opposed to point signs.
All right. Shall I move to the next paragraph? Any questions or comments, anything here? So we have someone on YouTube said it nicely. I missed it earlier. The comment on structure. Structure becomes machine with Deleuze, which is actually, I think, a really interesting way to sort of put it. I like that.
Well, yeah, you can also refer to Guattari's essay, Machine and Structure, which we did read on the server.
Yes, we did.
We never uploaded it. I thought Machine and Structure went pretty well in our discussion. I really enjoyed leading that reading. But
we should do it again.
I'm not reading that fucking essay again, man. Actually, Brooks, do you have the recording of Machine and Structure?
I don't know.
I don't know if I have it, because I don't remember who put the voice bot. Maybe it's me, and I have to find it somewhere. But yeah, I mean, Machine and Structure for Guattari he's drawing a lot on that one structuralist comment in Difference and Repetition, specifically Chapter 4, and the difference between differentiation and differentiation in Deleuze, right? Two very different things. Differentiation is to do with intensities, and differentiation has to do with the reciprocal determination and the virtual. You can talk about how the structure is, first of all, constituted in a machinic process. So for Deleuze, Guattari finds this solution in the use of differentiation and differentiation in Difference and Repetition, which is an interesting point.
Excellent. To continue to the next paragraph. Similarly, in the plastic arts, there is a pure figural dimension formed by the active line and the multidimensional point, and on the other hand, the multiple configurations formed by the passive line and the surface it engenders, so as to reveal, as in Paul Klee, those intermundia that perhaps are visible only to children, madmen, and primitive. Or in dreams, in some very beautiful pages, Leotard shows that what is at work in dream is not the signifier, but a figural dimension underneath, which gives rise to configurations of images that make use of words, making them flow and cutting them according to flows and points that are not linguistic and do not depend on the signifier or its regulated element. Thus, Leotard everywhere reverses the order of the signifier and the figure. It is not the figures that depend on the signifier and its effects, but the signifying chain that depends on the figural effects, this chain itself being composed of asignifying signs, crushing the signifiers as well as the signifieds, treating words as things, fabricating new unities, creating from non-figurative figures configurations of images that form and then disintegrate. And these constellations are like flows that imply the breaks affected by points, just as the points imply the fluxion of the material they cause to flow or leak. The sole unity without identity is that of the flux schiz or the break flow. the pure figural element, the figure matrix. Leotard correctly names desire, which carries us to the gates of schizophrenia as a process. There's so many good lines in this fucking paragraph. This is a good paragraph. I like this paragraph. All right. Where do we even start then? I would just say straight to the dreams. In some beautiful pages, Leotard shows that what his work in dreams is not the signifier. It is not the signifier, but a figural dimension underneath, which gives rise to configurations of images that make use of words, making them flow and cutting them according to flows and points. This process, I think, is very on the nose for us. And as we talk about sort of what these things or how this thing functions or what these things do, how this process works, that's probably the nicest, crispest version so far we've had of their version of sort of underlying the flows pushing into images, pushing into the configurations of images that push into words, making them flow, cut them according to flows and points. It's a really nice segment that's straight from Leotard's work.
I put this image in the chat. It's a painting by Paul Klee, done with, pretty sure it's done with the knife. It's called like Twittering Machine or something. I think this is the painting that he's actually referring to when he talks about Paul Klee.
All right, are you guys still there? My audio shit out. I need to get a new microphone. It's a nightmare. Varun?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Making sure it's working. So the image you post, after a little light bit of Googling, which is what kicked my mic offline, I think you're right. And I think the line here he uses, intermundia that are visible to children, madmen, and primitives. I love that phrasing because we're talking about the underlying flows, the elements, the passive line on the surface it engenders, this multidimensional point. The way he's phrasing it is these things, these elements that only these specific people would be able to notice. Everyone else would see the end point, I guess you might say. Like there's a process that these paintings show, and I think it's a really fantastic version of it. Thank you for posting it. I made it full screen for the stream. We have it. It's a great. The line, it is not the figures that depend on the signifier and its effects, but the signifying chain that depends on the figural effects, this chain itself being composed of a signifying sign. Fantastic.
Yeah, I posted a pretty introductory video to this piece too.
Thank you. I'll watch that afterwards.
Yeah, there's also this piece is not there's also De La Redolne, which is like an essay they wrote on like on the refrain in 1,000 Plateaus, which on the refrain, Paul Klee is mentioned a lot in that, especially this piece.
All right. I think, is that any questions on this paragraph? Any elements or things for this one before we move on? Because I kind of want to make sure we get through at least the movement from Leotard to Lacan, and which happens in the next paragraph and two. I want to make sure we get through at least that today. So that way we have a nice break point, so we don't have to go back and revisit all of this stuff again. The last line in this paragraph is the one that, again, they like to finish off with a lot of stuff that's important. Last line, the pure figural element, the figure matrix, Leotard correctly names desire, which carries us to the gates of schizophrenia as a process. To continue. But what explains the reader's impression that Leotard is continually arresting the process and steering the schizas toward shores he has so recently left behind, toward coded or overcoded territories, spaces, and structures to which they only bring transgressions, disorders, and deformations that are secondary in spite of everything, instead of forming and transporting further the desiring machines that are in opposition to the structures and the intensities that are in opposition to the spaces. The explanation is that despite his attempt at linking desire to a fundamental yes, Leotard reintroduces lack and absence into desire, maintains desire under the law of castration at the risk of restoring the entire signifier along with the law, and discovers the matrix of the figure in fantasy, the simple fantasy that comes to veil desiring production, the whole of desire as effective production. But, at least for an instant, the mortgage of the signifier was raised, that enormous archaism that causes so many of us to groan and bow under its weight, and that others use to establish a new terrorism, diverting Lacan's imperial discourse into a university discourse characterized by a pure scientificity, that scientificity perfectly suited for resupplying our neurosis, for strangling the process once again, and for overcoating Oedipus with castration, well, chaining us to the current structural format function of a vanished archaic despot. For it is certain that even and especially in their manifestations of extreme force, neither capitalism nor revolution nor schizophrenia follows the path of the signifier. Fairly crisp paragraph. I mean, to me, we're going to be revisiting Oedipus here a lot as we kind of move forward, but this is a poke back and a sort of callback to the discussion we've had, which is Oedipus at last, or how Oedipus works within this. But underneath all of this, Leotard ultimately could not help himself but reintroduce lack and absence into desire as elements, or as a missing, as a negative, as these things, these parts of it. And he couldn't help, because ultimately he's still dealing with this law of castration, the entire signification matrix that sort of comes with that, the play of fantasy, the simple fantasy that comes to veil desiring production, the whole of desire as effective production. This is one of their sort of underlying critiques of a lot of things, but this is their push towards specifically that, and then again to Lacan, which is a cheeky ass comment bit here, the imperial discourse into a university discourse. But hey, I'm not super Lacan, so I won't pretend to be too well read on it, but it's a pretty snarky thing to say. I like it. But again, coming back to this idea of strangling the process, controlling desire, placing this overcoating on it. And the last line is the one I attached to, which is signification, neither capitalism nor revolution nor schizophrenia, those three said together, is one of the very unique parts of this text, and what they're pushing towards and how they're playing towards might be what comes next, or ultimately chapter 4 in schizoanalysis. But even in manifestations of extreme force, neither capitalism, revolution, or schizophrenia follow the paths of the signifier, that they instead go this Yelmslevian route of the sort of imminent creation of the content and the expression in those points. Comments, questions, anything?
Then the big thing is the way that they're tying the signifying chain with the figure, right? Because that's the thing that Leotard gets right to Deleuze and Guattari, is that the figures do not depend on the signifier and its effects, right? So that would be like more Lacanian or Saussurian, perhaps. But they go on to say, but the signifying chain that depends on the figural effects, this chain itself being composed of asignifying signs, crushing the signifiers as well as the signifieds, treating words as things, which is that comment about like the partial objects again, fabricating new unities, creating from non-figurative figures configurations of images that form and then disintegrate. Right, so that's the big move that Leotard gives us, is this way of understanding how the schizophrenic process is actually producing these figures and these signifying chains, which is going to give us our point signs. And then look, the move is then to say, right, but Leotard is also suffering, or his theory suffers from using the paralogism of signification, right, which is going to be to, in a sense, what they're kind of getting at is then that this process, right, which he has the figurative matrix, the name of desire, well, if it has a name, the figurative matrix is then going to have to rely on signification or representation, is going to be where Leotard messes up here.
That's a great summation of the paragraph. Any questions on any phrasing elements here before we move on? Please, anyone, feel free to type it out wherever you're at, or if you're in the chat, you're free to unmute yourself and say a thing or two if you'd like. Otherwise, I'll move to the next paragraph. All right, the next one's a big one. So this will probably be the last paragraph for the day, and we will spend time discussing it. This one sucks. This is like a 3-paragraph paragraph. No, I mean, it sucks as in it's bad. It's just, I get lost reading this one.
You want to divide it into chunks?
Can it be divided into chunks? I mean, not to get too much of an ass comment, but like the whole in its parts here is kind of important, because the last line is the question of why they're asking all of this. Like, those questions are what make this.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, I'm wondering, we could, because there's a bit to talk about the private man stuff.
No, that's fair. So let's see. Let's go up to discernible identity. So it'll just be like, that's like 2 sentences, and we'll take breaks as we go. Maybe this one is actually worth taking breaks pretty regularly. So,
okay, you want me to read?
If you would like to, you're more than welcome.
Civilization is defined by the decoding and the deterritorialization of flows in capitalist production. Any method will do for ensuring the universal decoding, the privatization brought to bear on property, goods, and the means of production, but also on the organs of private man himself. The abstraction of monetary qualities, but also the abstraction of the quantity of labor, the limitless nature of the relationship between capital and labor capacity, and between the flows of financing and the flows of income or means of payment, the scientific and technical form assumed by flows of code themselves, the formation of floating configurations starting from lines and points without a discernible identity. I mean, this really reads more like a conclusion of what capitalism is. It's the production of things like property, right? That's not to say that things like property are not real. They're very much real, but they can only exist in this system. Because if we go back to their more anthropological work with savages and barbarians and stuff like that, they talk about how these different debt alliances were what held society together, right? One clear example is gift giving. You always gave more or less so that you can always be in a relationship with somebody else. So you always have to give back. So that means you never reciprocate a gift that's of equal value. Because if you do that, then you break the kinship organization. I mean, that's just one example of a relationship that's held together by debt. And over here, when you get to the capitalist version of this, essentially what you produce is this what they're talking about is you produce a new organism, and that's one of the aspects of Deleuze and Guattari that's very interesting, because what they're going to say is that things, I mean, this is going to depend on your reading. This is, I like to read these stuff that they say about organs and stuff as literally as possible. So they're basically saying they change the way your body is, because if we go back to the very first 10 pages of the book, the distinction between the physical body and biological systems and the social organization which they hold don't share any distinction for Deleuze and Guattari. It's a distinction that's merely superficial, or as they say, merely phenomenological. And in this sense, what we have here is that they have like this. What they're doing is basically a theory of evolution, right? How do we develop the traits that we have? Well, we develop it in this environment that's included in a social system. And so things like private man, the fact that your organs are considered as your own, rather than being this collective thing shared by the body without organs of the earth, or the body without organs of the despot. That the fact that you have this notion of a private body without organs is symptomatic of capitalism. So I mean, that's what they mean by private man. It's the fact that these partial objects can be separated and stratified in a specific way for it to be removed from different circumstances. And at least for now, I mean, that's not to say that one is better than the other. They're not saying that one time period was better than this time period, etc., etc. What they're saying, moreover, is that there's a certain difference in what we're experiencing now.
Well, and it's the definition of civilization here, defined by the decoding and the deterritorialization of flows in capitalist production. Any method will do for ensuring this universal decoding. That sentence, as they kind of continue really through the rest of this paragraph, is sort of an underlying point where we're sort of screaming forward at whatever it takes. And it's any method. The method first is the privatization brought to bear on all of these things, but also the abstraction of labor as another method. The formation of floating configurations starting from lines and points without a discernible identity. All that matters is there's a universal decoding. That's what capitalism cares about. Like, that's the thing that matters. That's capitalist production in a nutshell across the board.
Mm-hmm. And this comes with an important theoretical difficulty, right? Because what we're ultimately getting at here is, so the two sentences you just, or the two phrases you just looked at, so I read those in the Mcluhan thing they were talking about earlier, two mediums, right? And so we can say with the despotic, there's the medium of overcoding that comes to constitute the barbarian, right? In a similar way, we can say that capital is involved in, right, the universal decoding. So what is civilization? Well, civilization is understood through the medium of decoding and deterritorialization, right? As opposed to overcoding and that kind of interplay of the overcoding and then the problem of like decoding and recoding. So if you push that a little bit further here, then that means we're dealing with capitalism in the medium of schizophrenia, right? Or constant reconfiguration. What are the mediums then of the schizophrenic process for the decoding and deterritorialization that capitalism uses to constitute civilization? And this is where the flux really is, I think. Well, what you just read, that list, I like your point there that is a list and those are methods, because what you're getting there then is a series of schizophrenic mediums for deterritorializing and decoding, right?
Yes. Well, and I'm going to get into the next grouping. I'm going to continue reading really quick. The route taken by the decoded flows is traced by recent monetary history. The role of the dollar, short-term migrating capital, the floating of currencies, the new means of financing and credit, the special drawing rights, and the new form of crises and speculation. Our societies exhibit a marked taste for all codes foreign or exotic, but this taste is destructive and morbid.
That's a great bit. The bit about money and stuff. Yeah. I mean, this is. I mean, this really is starting to look like the conclusion to what that whole stuff we saw at the very beginning with regards to exchange relationships, what it all leads up to. Capitalism is essentially schizophrenizing. You can find a simple example of this in the sense of, a very novel invention nowadays is a grocery store. You can't, a grocery store couldn't exist during kinship times because the medium of exchange within that store wouldn't make any sense. You can't just go and, have all these products and then buy it. So what's happening is, in capitalism, the codes are always being scrambled because you're always having these new relationships of production, and you can think about things like advertising, constantly reinserting desire into these fields and constantly replugging it in and plugging it out, which in a sense, you have, it's like saying, when you go to the grocery store, you feel lost, you have too many options. Which cereal do I buy? Why are there so many options of cereal? Blah, blah, blah. These are all, symptoms of what the effect of scrambling all the codes are.
Well, I mean, if you want to, my favorite example that I couldn't help because I was pre-reading this, NFTs. There's an NFT. If you're not familiar with cryptocurrency, it's a giant nightmare, weird Ayn Rand, Mad Max wasteland. But one specific example is fascinating. It's called the N Project. There's 1,000 NFTs that have random numbers. That's it. They don't do anything. They don't have art. It's just random numbers. And they're selling for literally thousands of dollars. I think $20,000 to $40,000 each. That as a thing, just take a second to think through that. But if you want to talk about the schizophrenizing and the mixing up of codes, that's a pretty fucking good example as far as I can think.
Well, and let's expand this with the Leotardian point here, right? Because if this is a process of schizophrenization, then right, the Leotard's point does hold about the creation of images and the way in which they're dealing with the signifying chain so as to constitute what is effectively the coordination and ultimately the subjectivity that will be consummated and consumed, right? Just to put it in capital. And with that, there's this question of perpetuation because we saw them call it the limitless in that. So with the despotic in that, we had a paranoiac medium, right? Particularly through the medium of overcoding in relation to the despotic and the aristot, right? We'll see this later, but I want to mention it now because I think it helps to understand what's going on here. Because Leotard's got another point, which is the way in which signification is being subverted by the figure matrix, right? By desire. At the same time, those codifications, especially those overcodings, are still being constituted. And that gives us the relation of the aristot and ultimately the interplay of that overcoding process, right? That paranoiac process, especially. And then the schizophrenic process we're describing now, where the way in which signification is happening here through content and expression, those two playing on each other is ultimately what we mean when we're talking about the delirium. In a nutshell, there's also the recording process in that, but the recording of that interplay is what we're getting at here in terms of understanding civilization's delirium rather than its discontents.
Now I'm going to continue to the next bit because I think that continues it. Let's see, where did I leave off? Destructive morbid. Well, decoding doubtless means understanding and translating a code. It also means destroying the code as such, assigning it an archaic, folkloric, or residual function, which makes of psychoanalysis and ethnology two disciplines highly regarded in our modern society. Stop there. Oh my God. How to put it? Why is something cool? Well, if I actually break it down and I explain every bit of it, I ruin the thing that was cool. That's the decoding of it as such immediately by quantifying it in such a place. destroys the code as such, assigns it this archaic folkloric residual function, and psychoanalysis and ethnology do this. This is what they do, is they break down the desires, the pushes, the whys, the deconstruction of it, but by doing so, the code loses meaning. The cynicism of the time here, I go back to David Foster Wallace and his talk about how people sit and talk through and mock in this sort of postmodern ironic cynicism the earnestness of musicals or old TV shows, or how hokey they were, or these things, because now we understand that, oh, these things are silly and we're kind of beyond them. This is what he's talking about, the cynicism of the modern societies, is this deconstruction that is breaking down these codes, but by decoding them immediately, we've destroyed the code as it existed as such, because it was flows. Now we've broken it down as such, we've assigned it this other thing, we've done all these things, and this moves us into a different position where now those codes, because they're concretized, they're kind of dead. They're still there, but they're not interesting. They're not the next thing. There's a lot of examples of this actually in just general society, of the things we aren't allowed to say or talk about. The things inside of different situations you won't call out or you won't break down, in the worry that what if someone else calls it? The joke running around about unicorns in the VC community, unicorns, Twitter, these companies that are valued at billions of dollars, who've never turned a profit and probably never will, but they don't talk about that, because if they did, these things start falling apart, the codes of these elements. They're not dealing with flows, they're dealing with the codes. It's a really interesting play. But again, towards this idea that psychoanalysis and ethnology become highly regarded in a modern society because it's able to break them down. It's able to do these things that decode, that create sort of this moment or this residual function. And then to continue, is that a fair assessment of that little bit, Varun? Anyone? Because it's a complex idea. I just want to make sure we try to get it across.
I mean, I really liked your opener, right? When I explained something, I ruined it. I mean, and that is kind of it, right? Because you're getting two operations, right? You're getting decoding in terms of the translation, which comes with by the same token destruction, right? So when you place it in terms of what something means, and you bring in the overcoding process, right? Well, I assume it's the overcoding process, but the translation, in one sense, you are kind of providing form and expression, a playscape, if you will. But at the same time, you are also destroying the form and expression that's there too, right? Because you're breaking down, since it's decoding and that, right? You're breaking down how the figure matrix is operating, and then the same token, right? There's the problem of then working with the overcoding, that then you get this really great tension between the two.
Yeah, I like that. I'm going to read the next little bit. It's a little bit longer. I'm going to go up until the end of production process. Yet, it would be a serious error to consider the capitalist flows and the schizophrenic flows as identical under the general theme of a decoding of the flows of desire. Their affinity is great, to be sure. Everywhere capitalism sets in motion schizoflows that animate our arts and our sciences, just as they congeal into the production of our own sick schizophrenics. We have seen that the relationship of schizophrenia to capitalism went far beyond problems of modes of living, environment, ideology, etc., and that it should be examined at the deepest level of one and the same economy, one and the same production process. Mostly I wanted to block this out because there's two bits that they're talking about here, and it's the next sentence repeats this. But I kind of want to make sure we state it cleanly first. Capitalist flows and schizophrenic flows are not the same thing. Aside from one being more molecular, one being molar, they're not identical. They don't do the same stuff. Their affinity is great. one sets the other in motion, one even produces the other significantly. Ultimately, society does produce schizos, as they talk about it. But the need is that capitalism and schizophrenia are so deeply intertwined that talking about one without the other is pointless. They're the deepest level of the same economy, the same production process. And that's the part I wanted to make sure we hit on that. Any other analysis, please? Question? All right, then I'll move to the next little bit here, and then I may just go to the end, because the rest of this is kind of a little bit and then a series of questions of their overall doubt. So if anyone has any other thoughts, I'm going to kind of read to the end of this, please. Varun.
Are we at Our Society?
Yes.
You mind I read? I really like this bit.
Sure, go for it.
Our society produces schizos the same way it produces Pearl shampoo or Ford cars, the only difference being the schizos are not saleable. How then does one explain the fact that capitalist production is constantly arresting the schizophrenic process and transforming the subject of the process into a confined clinical entity, as though it saw this process the image of its own death coming from within? Why does it make the schizophrenic into a sick person not only nominally, but in reality? Why does it confine its madman and madwoman instead of seeing in them its own heroes and heroines, its own fulfillment? And instead of seeing and where it can no longer recognize the figure of a simple illness, why does it keep its artists and even its scientists under such close surveillance, as though they risked unleashing the flows that would be dangerous for capitalist production and charged with a revolutionary potential? So long as these flows are not co-opted or absorbed by the laws of the market, why does it form in a gigantic machine for social repression, psychic repression, aimed at what nevertheless constitutes its own reality, the decoded flows?
I love all of those questions because it's just accurate. Our society produces schizos. It produces this sort of nature in people, this sickness, as we've talked about it, the way that repression works, the way that lack is produced, the way that repression works within us, the paralogisms, all of this. And the question would be, so it produces this people in this setup. Why then does it actually make them into a sick person? Why does it treat them as so deeply non-normative as to be worthy of jailing, as to be worthy of holding up and drugging and doing these things to? Why does it confine its madmen and madwomen instead of seeing them as its heroes and heroines, its own fulfillment? If it's giving birth to them and this is this perfection of the process, oh my Lord, I am a schizophrenic process. I am capitalism. These are my children. Why am I not cheering them on? Why do I hold them down as though they risked unleashing flows that would be dangerous for capitalist production, charged with revolutionary potential, as long as these flows are not co-opted or absorbed by the laws of the market? Why does it form, in turn, a gigantic machine for social repression and psychic repression, aimed at what nevertheless constitutes its own reality, decoded flows? It's such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful piece. I like that a lot. Very much, very much. Also, I like the line, it produces schizos the same way it produces Prel shampoo. Just fucking very nice and to the point, and a little dark, but true.
Is Prel shampoo popular in France?
I think in the 60s and 70s, there weren't a lot of, like, they didn't have a shampoo aisle. Like, I think there were only a handful, and Prel was one of the big.
Well, now we know what Deleuze uses.
You're assuming he takes showers at baths.
I mean, for someone who's balding, his hair looks pretty good. I mean, he managed to keep it pretty nice.
And I think we will leave off actually on those questions. Any comments or questions up to this point? We will continue from the bottom of 240.